1909. London. The future. Feminist terrorists have cut the world's population by 95% with a sustained onslaught of neutron bombing. The Earth has been set slightly out of orbit, leaving, according to calculations by those still alive, just 2,350 years before it burns up. The surviving elite of women scientists, as a testimony to the event, decide the world's years will be chronicled in reverse order from that year on. It is 1909. 441 years after the bombing. Women are the ruling class, the populite. Men, the underclass, live and work together. Relations between men and women are forbidden, punishable by death. London is in the grip of the Republican activists, a male anarchist group trying to wrestle local power from the populite. Their hunger for equality has led to increased acts of terror and random violence. Mauder, a political dissident, is a man trying desperately to fight off his heterosexual urges. Ricassa Milo, his employer and the subject of his fantasies, is a woman blighted by the discovery that she is not like other women and cannot bear children. She has consequently not been subjected to the unsexing of the national sterilization process and has become aware of unnatural urges that she must somehow control and remove before she is discovered, reported, and ultimately executed. Chapter 5. International Women's Day. Provlin lay awake, as he had done for most of the night. Mauder had always been a little furtive, but it was usually attributable to a recent or forthcoming event. Now it was just baffling, and the presence of Lorcos downstairs had made him even more withdrawn. They'd invited him for a meal to discuss what arrangements for care they could make after they'd collected the boy from the siring school next Friday. But judging by his expression when he returned, Mauder had obviously forgotten. He'd been covered in a thin, powdery dust. I went to look at some rebuilding they'd been doing in the city. His only genuine suit, the one that had cost him almost a month's wages, caked with concrete powder. And half an hour cleaning it. In the cellar? Once they'd put the 6-year-old Hadana to bed, in the spare room, Lorcos had revealed the true extent of his own problems. 5 months after the death of his partner, he'd finally been forced to give up his job with the demolition company, even though his son was now going to a local school, because they were not prepared to give him shorter hours. Provlin had declared himself quite happy to give him 30 shillings a week, half of the higher wages he was now getting, in return for looking after their sireling. By the time the evening was over, it was past curfew, and Lorcos was still there. The arrangement had not pleased Mauder at all, though he had kept his feelings from Lorcos. They'd not even been able to discuss it because of the risk of waking Hadana. At least Mauder could sleep. His suit hung in the bedroom doorway, stained patches of wetness in evidence around the arm and pocket areas. Provlin knew that in a month's time they would have been together for exactly 5 years. A few weeks beyond this would signal Mauder's entry into uncharted waters. He'd made quite an issue of his relationship with Harville lasting 5 years and 3 days. He told me he just wanted to see us properly through the full 5 years. Perhaps that was where Provlin had got the superstition from. International Women's Day. The headline covered 3/4 of the Saturday front page of the Informer. Mauder crunched his way through a piece of burnt toast. The paper had compiled its own list of Women of the Year, with the subheader, So Far. They were all there: Queen Edwina VII, Herbert Asquith, Ethel Smythe, who'd written some opera, Andrea Carnegie, a campaigner for world peace — world communication would have been more ambitious — and several others, including Serbeth Chalice. It could be worse, Lorcos said. He was cleaning his son's face, spitting gobbets onto a grey-looking handkerchief and fingering away corners of grubbiness with pokes of his cottoned finger. Provlin was trying to hurry him up so they could all leave together, but Mauder was decidedly sluggish, sipping at his tea as if through ulcer-lined lips. He was resigned eventually to a solitary departure, leaving the house at 6:45. Within 5 minutes, Mauder was fully dressed and at the door. "Let yourself out when you're ready," he told them. "There's no rush." He closed the door behind him and marched off swiftly to the station. Tucked in his inside pocket were a bundle of papers that he had grabbed from the denim satchel after Provlin had gone. The need for the irritating subterfuge had at least given him the chance to look at some of the documents alone before he got into work. He might yet decide that no one else should see them, and he would then have to make sure he was back first that evening. The fact that he was not free in the afternoon was another irritating aspect of International Women's Day. Men were asked to work a full day to free their bosses or seniors, who were usually busy taking stock of the week's activities, for celebrations. Even time and a half failed to soothe the sting Mauder always felt from this annual tradition. The early morning wind whipped up the grove through the trees, causing Mauder to button his jacket. Most of yesterday's dust stains seemed to be fading. He began pondering just how a 71-year-old school project could have become embedded in a piece of concrete nearly 400 years old. They might have built an extension to the Carricott building then, or set something new in stone. Highly unlikely though the possibilities were. As he reached the top of the road, he studied the government hoarding. "A paid toll tax return gives you your free democratic rights," under which someone had scribbled, "Fight for your democratic right to pay fuck all." Though a hose-wielding council worker was already jetting out the offensive addendum with some high-powered chemical solution. He decided to sit in one of the Populite carriages, an act permissible only in the rush hour when the other carriages were full, but the rule was still new enough to excuse a liberal interpretation if he were questioned. The train stood in the station for some time, and it was only when Mauder got up to see what was causing the delay that it began to move off. He sat down again with his back to the door leading to the carriage behind and finally unbuttoned his jacket. The surrounding folder was of a light blue card with a child's crayoned drawing of a group of his classmates headed Doomsday 1980. On the inside cover, his name, Sharon Lewis. Mauder read the instruction. "Hello from all of us at Dovedale Secondary School in 1980. You are from the future, which means someone must be knocking down the Carricott building because that is where we're going to be putting this when we finish it. Lots of schools in our country are writing one of these, so our teacher, Mr. Evans, thought we should do one." Mauder looked over his shoulder. A few bored-looking people in the next carriage. No one was interested. They probably wouldn't even care if they knew what he was reading. "We hope you can understand what we're writing. You might speak and spell differently. We are all 13 and 14, apart from Mr. Evans, who is 31. We hope we've put the kind of things in here that will interest you, but again, things might change a bit, and we don't know how." He went to turn the page, and a coloured photograph fell out. Like the paper, it was yellowing slightly, but it was the first tangible set of differences he had noticed. The children were all Caucasians, like himself, but more unusual and a little unbelievable. He had to hold the picture steady. Some of them were young women. Some of them were girls. He instinctively thrust the photograph back into the folder and inside his jacket. What on earth had he got hold of? He stood up and moved to one side of the carriage doors, his head pounding. 7:20. He hadn't enough time to go back. He would have to take it into work, carry it round with him all day. He couldn't leave it anywhere. It would make an activist pamphlet look like a children's fairy story. The train drew into a station, Portland Road. His mind was racing. Was this some radical school run in the early 20th century, or was this a different 1980? If the Carricott building had been built in the other age, it was at least 400 years old. That would mean it had been built around 2309, so what was all this 1980 business? His attention was drawn to a notice in the carriage. It was one he had not seen before, but it bore the standard government bold black lettering printed on a gold background like the one he'd seen in the Grove. This one read, "Warning. All toll tax forms should be returned by April the 30th. From May the 30th, 1909 in the United Kingdom, it will be mandatory to carry evidence of your toll tax number with you at all times. Failure to do so could result in a fine of up to £50. He should have seen such a notice before, but he hadn't. Only now, by chance in a poppy-like carriage, had it come to his attention. He'd already submitted the forms over a week ago, but they had as yet received no reply. He looked at the notice again to see if he'd misread it, but the words seemed to harden, their significance lying within their businesslike appearance like a Venus flytrap. The journey was taking on an unreal quality. The insecurity he'd eschewed through a lifetime of gentle conforming and hard faith was returning as the train gathered speed. He looked around. No one. So much was changing, and yet there were so few people watching. No one could ever be safe from potential harassment on the streets when this new clause became law. Anyone could be stopped, their number demanded, and, consequently, their details. It wasn't an aspect of the new tax law that Maude had ever been aware of during its media inception. And how many other people were still unaware of the consequences of this new power vested in the authorities? He gritted his teeth and took a firm hold of the package he held under the front of his jacket. It was now 2 weeks since the beginning of his illness, but Provlin was still being careful in his movements around Parkside. He hadn't anticipated any need to sort the problem out yet. Lady Chalice had another at-home, and the house would be very busy in the next few hours. He'd remained downstairs after an overly swift cleaning of the clerk's rooms. He later helped the greengrocer unload the week's produce in the yard at the side of the house, before helping Chatwick unfurl the Venus flag from the pulley in the loft. A newspaper photographer turned up just before lunch to take a picture of the women, almost certainly destined for one of the following morning's front pages. He wasn't as keen as Maude to question the significance of an International Women's Day, nor did it matter to him that there didn't seem to be an International Day for men. He was happy to live in a free country that, now the problem with looking after his son had been sorted out, paid him enough money and gave him enough free time to enjoy his life. He would, however, have to wait until the end of the week to find out whether or not his last week's pay packet had been a one-off bonus incentive or a genuinely unexpected increase. Amongst Lady Chalice's guests that morning were some of the more successful businesswomen of the year, including 2 teams of 4 from the top 2 financial houses, Bannisters and Paulbys, something that would no doubt interest Maude. He'd make a note of their names from the dining plan later in the afternoon when they'd gone. Just before lunch he was given the task of sorting out the wine in the second larder and the cellar into years and makes, and copying them up into a new black plastic copybook that Chatwick had brought the previous weekend. A trip down to the cellar with what he was told was the only key, and one back to the second larder, made it clear that this was a job that would take a good 2 hours, so he decided in favour of a late lunch. There were rosés and Medocs, clarets and burgundies, hocks and moselles, Bordeaux and Beaujolais, some that should have been consumed 30 years ago, some that were still at their best. Not that any expertise was expected of Provlin. He'd merely been asked to list the stock and ensure before he finished that everything was put in the cellar, the whites in the lower racks, the reds in the uppers. It was one of those once-a-year jobs in the house that carried an inbuilt pleasure because of their novelty. He'd been invited to take 2 bottles home, but not to drink anything until he checked it with Chatwick, who knew about wine. Provlin was fairly sure that his relationship with it fell short of Dorges's expertise, at falling foul of it, in any case. As he began listing the headings under which the different wines would be divided, he thought about the boy, and about becoming a father so young. He could never replace his own father, but by becoming a father himself he would somehow renew the cycle, replenish the turning where it had stopped. His father would have been pleased he had a job and was earning money. Part of the reason he was determined to work so hard at keeping the job was because he knew how his father would have felt. It encouraged him. It inspired him. He'd left his hometown as a 15-year-old after his father's death. He'd left it to go and live with a 24-year-old man in London. What would his father have made of that? As a boy, he and his father had lived in a small flat in Manchester for all the early years he could remember, before that day at school when his house tutor had told him the news. His father dead. Not even 40. Killed on an exercise. Not even killed by an enemy. A stupid way to go. Almost as stupid and quick as the way he had gone 3 evenings later at the peacetime dance. Just a few weeks after his father's warning about the lure of the city and what older men might promise him. A standing prick has no conscience, Provlin. You'll only make promises you can't keep, or you'll keep them and be sorry. But was this sorrow? There was a creak on the cellar stairs behind him, and he looked up. "Looks like paradise," the voice said at the top of the stairs. "I've wanted the key to this place for many years. I thought they might have thrown it away, but they obviously haven't." The voice moved down into the dim lit of the cellar. "Chatwick, I thought you'd gone to lunch." "I was going to, but Lady Chalice told me you were working down in the cellar, so I thought I'd join you." He took out a small tin of lettuce and tomato sandwiches and a few savoury biscuits. If Provlin had been capable of suspicion, he might have hunted for an excuse to take lunch elsewhere. As it was, he continued looking through the rack of bottles behind him. "This one looks reasonably new. A French claret, 1911. Yes, that'll do nicely." 2 bottles and 8 sandwiches later, the conversation was ripening. "I signed my contract last Monday," Chatwick said. "It's made a pleasant enough difference to my pay packet. I went to the theatre last weekend. First time for nearly 5 years. You ought to get round to it, you know." "I don't like the theatre." "I meant your contract." Provlin looked at him wistfully. It seemed a genuine enough piece of advice. "I can't sign Chatwick. He'd be 10 before I could get out of it. Can't you see how terrible it would be if I suddenly changed my mind?" "Who would be 10? Provlin felt light-headed, stripped of the self-imposed restraint he wore as a part of his uniform at Parkside. "My friend and I went to a siring trial last week." The child's podgy face stared suspiciously at him again from the corner of the pen. "He's 16.5 months old, black hair, dark skin, with this evil stare. You'd have signed for him if you'd been there." Provlin leant back and knocked over the bottle of wine behind him. Chatwick moved round him swiftly, mopping up the spillage with a cloth which he carried under his jacket. His glass of wine had barely been touched. "You never told me about your friend," Chatwick said. "He signed our contract," Provlin said. "That's why I can't sign this one. I've spoken to Lady Chalice about it, and she understands. She's been as kind to me as you have. I'm very grateful for that." He turned back to the first rack on his hands and knees, looking for the pencil he'd been writing with. When he'd written claret on a new page, he turned round. The wall was starting to slide. He steadied himself. Where Chatwick had been, there was an empty tin, and when he looked up the stairs, it was a very different face that looked down at him, smiling this time, the hand steadily holding a full glass of claret. Mauder had waited 2 frustrating hours, visiting the washrooms twice before satisfying himself that the 2 offices next to his, housing clerks 13 and 14, were going to be, to the best of his knowledge, empty for the day. Not everyone, apparently, had to work today. Fighting through the morning's paperwork, the financial accounting behind the destruction of 4 major office blocks in Knightsbridge, he'd cleared a half-hour gap before lunch. 2 debenture books balanced on an elaborate high-rise stand of empty inkwells he'd found in his cupboard. Under these, he'd arranged a spread of the next few sheets from the blue folder. He'd turned the photograph face down, unable to look again at the mixed gathering of innocent faces. The sheets on his desk carried the 3 titles: What I Do at the Weekend, Where We Live, and What's Happening in 1980. Working through the first, he began to think the package might not be so sinister after all. The author of the extract did a paper round, watched television, played football at the park, and went down to Hammersmith with his friends. It wasn't any different from what boys his age had probably done 71 years ago. Even today, the only difference was the television. Once the authorities had stopped broadcasting in 1949, people had soon realised that no matter how much electricity they pumped into them, they would never again show a picture. Harville had once said that they were still broadcasting programmes, but on a frequency out of reach of ordinary televisions. It It was an interesting rumour, but had probably only survived as long as it had because no one was in a position to prove or disprove it. The boy writing the extract had, it seemed, spent most of his life watching television. Had he lived in 1909, he would have probably been an avid reader of The Informer. Hammersmith hadn't changed a great deal either, according to the coloured map two of the children had put together. The Palais was still the central dancing venue in the area, Ravenscourt Park was in the same position, if a little smaller, and the tube lines ran to the same stations. Why were there girls in that picture? He turned it over slowly. Could the activists have organised such a school? The Republican activists weren't formed until the first order controls in the 40s. Civil strife only occurred in the declining years of the technological era. It was a picture out of time. Genuinely innocent smiles. He looked at the last sheet in front of him. What's happening in 1980? It was evident that this was not a project cobbled together over a few weeks. Each sheet looked as though it had been redrafted several times, and the sheets themselves all had the authentic smell and appearance of historical documents. He remembered the tacky souvenirs bought from France that he had in his dormitory at school. A mock ancient version of La Populite, the historical agreement signed in Paris in 2300 by the 15 nations, supposedly the document that had instituted Western civilization. These simple sheets of school-lined paper had the same tinted edges, the difference being that they were flaking at each edge. If he rubbed the corners between his thumb and forefinger, he could eventually wear them down to a light yellow powder. The Conservative Party were in power, more likely than not. John Lennon shot dead. He was a Beatle. Strange name to give an opposition party. The top film was Flash Gordon, the margin illustration a graphic portrayal of a muscular blonde man. The rest of it was just more names and events. Under a subheading, Our Fear, the extract became suddenly arresting. We have been told recently about our government's decision to invest 5,000 million on a new nuclear weapon, the Trident missile, which will replace the Polaris system in our country in 10 years. We know our government is spending billions of pounds on defence to arm itself against attack by countries from the East. It is a frightening time for all of us to know that people might use these weapons in our lifetime. We only hope that they never will. Morder held his hand over his mouth. It was from the other world, the previous world. Before the Great Rains, the Death Age and the Corbett Revolution, it had to be over 400 years old. His first feelings had been correct. He took the photograph in his hand and screwed it up, the cardboard backing crumbling in his hands. He tore it and ground it to a pile of dust, tears in his eyes. He tried to keep the thoughts away from his head, but they crept up on him like all the killer diseases the world had ever known. What? Who? Why? When? How? He took his handkerchief to his eyes. More than anything, he felt fear. What information would he find in the rest of the folder? How would the finding of it come to affect his life? He swept the dust from the photograph onto a piece of card and put it in a small envelope which he put away in his jacket pocket. He combed his hair in the mirror he kept in the top drawer of the filing cabinet and returned the inkwells to his stationery tray. He looked at his watch. There were only 20 minutes left of his lunch hour, but if he moved quickly to the cafe, he could dispose of the evidence. He would have to. All of it. Down the lavatory. He might as well go home on the train carrying a submachine gun in a plastic bag as have those sheets on him. As he moved his chair to get back up, he heard footsteps coming towards his end of the corridor. It was a dead end, and the other two clerks were out. Whoever it was could only be in the building to visit him. He busied himself in one of the accounts books. "Hello," a voice said. "Bit overzealous, aren't you? Working during the lunch hour?" He was ill-prepared for another shock, but it came, along with a paralysing speechlessness. The voice went on. "I've been meaning to come in last week, but I thought I'd do it today once I knew I could get a few of the more reactionary of the staff out. I wanted to apologise to you for the embarrassment you must have suffered at the meal the other night." He could feel the grains of the photograph dust in the sweat of his closed palms. It was like sand. I was part of the committee that thought up the idea of a little business integration for a change. I don't think any of us were aware of the friction it would cause. I can sympathise, he said. With the men, that is. The only time most of them see a woman is when she's in the building to check that they're doing their job properly. In the newspaper, justifying some new radical political measure, in a black and silver uniform ready to arrest them for breaking curfew, or in some law or employment office showing them what forms they have to fill out. I suppose they might have felt it was a little hypocritical for them to suddenly want to show a bit of solidarity. He wiped his hands on his thighs. Ricassa Milo nodded. She was still standing in front of the filing cabinet opposite him. It looked as though she were taking stock of the surroundings to convey the feel later to an estate agent. She pulled the top drawer out and then pushed it back in. "Do you know what day it is today, Maude?" "International Women's Day, I believe," he said guardedly. It was increasingly unsettling having her wander round the office, not knowing why she was there. Added to which the bundle of sheets in the folder was slowly making him feel like he was carrying an anvil in his inside pocket. "I have a ticket for Diaghilev's Ballet Russe at the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden this evening. You struck me as the sort of person who might enjoy a cultural night out." She took a blue-edged ticket from her bag and placed it on the corner of his desk. The only knowledge Maude had acquired about opera houses was a suspicion that it had been Harville's branch of the Republican activists who'd bombed the Kensington Opera Palace in 1915, though he denied it at the time. Like all other types of music, if you could get around to seeing a concert or going to a dance, you'd have some music. If not, you wouldn't. "I'll offer it to Pridge if you're not interested." "Leave me the ticket," Maude said. "What time does it finish?" 10:45. You can get a curfew pass from the box office before the performance if you show the ticket." She left and then put her head back round the door. "I meant to add, it's a royal performance, especially for International Women's Day. The Queen will be there." She shut the door, her clicking steps moving to the stairs and then disappearing into carpet. Maude coughed and cleared his throat, spitting the residue into his handkerchief. It was the only substance her appearance had seemed likely to prompt from him that afternoon. All his feelings seemed to have numbed and then hardened. What was he going to do with a ticket for the ballet? He almost felt like telling Pridge. It might go some way to settling their recent differences. "Here, let me help you up," Chatwick was saying, but the room was still spinning. He clutched at the table, forcing himself round to the chair. As he lowered himself down, he had the sensation that he was bleeding. He could feel a warm stickiness around his inner thighs. Chatwick passed him a cigarette, which he parked on the edge of his lower lip. "You must have fallen quite badly." A cold cloth was pressed to his temple. Something awful had happened to him, something unspeakable. It had something to do with the taste in his mouth, the bitter aftertaste. He sat up in the chair and tried to speak, but a horrible chewing sound came from his lips. He picked the cigarette up from the table. The clock. 7 o'clock! He had to get back! He tried to stand, but strong hands held him down. "You mustn't move until we let the doctor have a look at you. You must have hit your chin on one of the steps." He could hear Chatwick moving round the room, the sounds of drawers being opened and closed. What had they done to him? Through a blur in front of his eyes, he saw someone looking into his face. "He'll be all right, but it must have been quite a fall. Can you get that green bottle from my case? Thank you." A swab of some kind was dabbed over his eyes and across his chin. He tried to free himself from the sting, but found the swab pressed further into his face. He stubbed out the useless cigarette. Try as he might, he could not see much beyond the pain to remember what had happened. He saw the book he'd been writing the wine lists in, closed on the table. It was blood-stained. He expected any moment to have someone force a contract under his nose to be signed. His logic had to be failing him because he could only hear soothing voices inquiring after his health, dabbing things at him, faces looking on. The pain around his face soon became subsumed under a new pain below his back. It felt as if someone had taken a knife to his backside and attempted to tear out his innards. He retched as the pain increased. This time he was propped over an enamel bowl, a towel between its edge and his chin. He would have to get home soon. He would have to get away from this place the moment he felt the strength return to his legs. Mauder slipped quietly in at the front door, pushing it to with an almost inaudible click. The house felt empty, but it was almost 7. His shopping idea had made him late, a vacuum bag for keeping drinks cold. The shop assistants he'd spoken to on a cold Saturday evening had given him some serious stares. He'd found an alternative function for it. The paper bag it was in rustled noisily in the hush of the house. Provlin could be upstairs having a wash, but he would have heard him. There was one place in the house where sound didn't travel too well. He moved round desperately to the cellar entrance, but the catch was down. He lifted it up and lowered the vacuum bag over the back of the door before closing it. "Provlin?" There was a note from Lorcos on the table. "Thanks for the meal. You're welcome." But Provlin had not been back. His 2-ounce packet of tobacco lay untouched on the old radiogram. A few letters were couched in the letter rack. A phone bill, a pension scheme application from Paulby's, and an official brown envelope, their toll tax numbers sinisterly moulded on 2 white plastic cards. He poured himself a glass of soya milk from the larder. It was totally untypical for Provlin to be late, he thought, as he fingered the crisp white card bearing his name. He reflected plaintively that he'd been less than kind to him in the past weeks. He hadn't given him much support over the siling. He'd been sleeping alone too, and he'd let him convince him that he'd be able to deal with this Dorgeous man. If it had happened last year, he would have phoned the house and told that Chalice woman about it, had him dismissed. But since the beginning of the year, a curtain of wariness had often blown in the face of Mauder, occasionally checking his impulsive nature. It had first held him back behind the police van with Harville in it. It was keeping him more and more from telling Provlin his thoughts, his fears. He wanted to feel that he was protecting him from acquiring a radical state of mind, consolidating the idealistic innocence of his youth. But this was bilge. He came up from the cellar with the denim satchel and flicked through its contents. He tried to spurn the sense of nervous lunacy that had made him turn those 3 sheets and the photograph to powder. There wasn't nearly as much in there as his time away from the bag had made him think, but there were a few more photos and articles written in the same coloured ink by different hands. He folded it carefully into the satchel and pushed it all into the vacuum bag, sealing it with the airtight zip. Handling it had the same feel as rifling through the jacket of someone you'd just killed. Your heart spun out a dance beat of decibels. The ends of your fingers went clammy. He breathed in deeply as he threw away the paper bag that had housed his purchase, the vacuum bag now safe behind one of the joists in the loft. Provlin's height was one factor in the relocation, the other being the wariness of the satchel's contents. He knew that they would tell him many things that he was not ready to find out. There would be more questions that he could not answer. He would need time and a clear mind before he looked at them again. In any other circumstances, he would have spent the whole of the afternoon thinking about the ticket to the ballet, but it was only now that he took it out of his wallet. Complimentary it had, printed across it length and breadthways, making the 5 stamp almost illegible. It would have taken him 3 weeks to earn enough to buy the ticket, but there it was. Box 25. He scribbled a short note to Provlin on the back of Lorkov's note, took his jacket, and left the house. As he came out of Covent Garden Station, Mauder was swamped by crowds of women in expensive coats and more of that peculiar face paint. Across the streets, gold banners threw out the message everywhere. "It's International Women's Day," as if he didn't know. He slid uncomfortably through the crowd, a few heads turning to look at him, most too busy with their own conversation. He had at first thought someone might be giving him a chance to prove how brave he was, that it was a test of nerve as part of his apprenticeship. But it would be pointless. There were much simpler ways of putting him under pressure. In the note he'd told Provlin he was going to the theatre. Although it had sounded a lot less suspicious, it wouldn't help him much if anything happened to him. An official in a top hat was directing people along the street. He could see the opera house as he turned the corner. A building with that mysterious quality of history, one of those in no danger of being demolished. He was relieved to see a few male faces, although they looked destined for the cheaper seats, their excited expressions signalling a once-in-a-lifetime excursion. After taking a curfew pass and having his ticket stamped at the ticket office, he moved to the entrance labelled Boxes and Upper Circle. 3 different ushers checked his ticket on his way to the stairs, the last one stopping a tall woman in an evening dress to confirm, presumably, that she was prepared to let men into this section of the theatre. But he got past them and made his way to the Upper Circle bar. The smell of cigar smoke and the clink of glasses reminded him oddly of the Hammersmith Palais. There were over 1,000 people there, but as he stood at the railings of the bar, looking down at the crowds below, he felt alone. This was the point, was it? To show him how important he really was. He looked across the sea of drinking female faces at his reflection in the gold-rimmed mirror at the side of the bar. He looked quite smart in his suit, the powder stains having gone, and he smiled weakly at himself. "Can I see your ticket, please, sir?" a voice said alongside him. He noticed in the reflection before he looked round that it was one of the policewomen he'd seen at the house the night Harville was killed. Even though she was wearing an evening dress herself, she was obviously on duty. He handed his ticket to her without turning round. He watched her examine it out of the corner of his eye, his attention drawn to the hip section of her dress. Was it a gun, a coche, or a face paint bag? "Thank you," she said, returning the ticket. He watched her disappear into the crowd. It would be a good time to leave if the events so far were anything to go by. As he moved towards the stairs, a bell sounded. "The performance of Diaghilev's Ballet Russe begins in 5 minutes. Would you please finish your drinks and make your way to your seats?" A crowd of elderly women moved up the stairs towards him. He turned and went the other way, the crowd driving him up a further set of stairs. He eventually broke free and found an empty corridor with a distant exit sign. As he moved towards it, he saw the policewoman. He turned round again. He was facing another usher. "May I have your ticket, sir?" "Yes, but I—" "Box 25? Through the door on the left, up the stairs, and it's at the end of the corridor." Catching the last words behind him as he took off, Morder moved in the direction of the box. He soon had mastered the directions sufficiently to find himself at the curtains of box 25. A passing usher gave him a small silver key after examining his ticket, and he led himself into the box. Pushing past the red velvet curtains, he found a tiny vestibule with a hat rack and coat stand. Then a further set of curtains, which he pulled back. The audience was down there before him, jewellery and trinkets glinting in the light from the theatre chandeliers. It was a grand platform for a spectacular suicide. You would have to think of something suitable to scream as he went down there. He drew up his chair and sat down. There were, a little disconcertingly, 3 other chairs in the box, but with only a minute until the performance. He moved back through the curtains to the door and turned the lock. Back in his seat, the lights went down, and then one waving spotlight came shooting up past the upper gallery to the boxes, just missing box 25. Moving round to the right, it found its target and stopped. There was a shuffling as the audience stood. "Her Royal Highness Queen Edwina VII," a voice said over the intercom. A light rose on the orchestra below, and the national anthem was played. Morder considered the repetition of the words, "Save us the Queen." Had there always been a royal family? Had there been one in the other world? The music stopped amidst rapturous applause. Leaning out, Morder could just see a little withered arm waving mechanically. He looked round. It was now obvious why the security was so tight here. And there he was, just a few boxes along, his white toll tax card in his top pocket. They would search him. They would find the card, check the records. Provelin the Siling, Parkside. It would all be over. He would have to leave during the first interval. On the ledge of the box there was a complimentary spread of programmes. According to the programme for tonight, the first part was an hour and a half long. The lights were now out, and the orchestra stirred to perform a rousing opening. The curtains flew back and dancers poured onto the stage. It was only when the opening chorus of instruments subsided that Morder heard the scraping behind him. Someone was trying to get into the box. Genuine guests? The officials would have spare keys. He moved to one side of the curtain, holding his breath. The scraping became a gentle knocking. If a scene was created, the police might be called. He would have to open the door. He got up, the music having risen in volume again, drowning his steps to the door and turning of the key. The door was opened swiftly, the key taken from him, and turned once more in the lock. He looked up at Ricassa Milo, her back to the door. She looked angry. "Why did you lock the door?" "You didn't tell me anyone else was coming." She looked at him speculatively. "I said I had a ticket for the ballet. You took it. I didn't say anything about whether or not other people would be there. Now sit down, will you? You're making me nervous." He did as he was told. Right, let's do that. That would be whispering, wouldn't it? "Why did you lock the door? You didn't tell me anyone else was coming." She looked at him speculatively. "I said I had a ticket for the ballet. You took it. I didn't say anything about whether or not other people would be there. Now sit down, will you? You're making me nervous." He did as he was told and remained there for the next hour, drawn to the dancers on the stage. The program explained that Diaghilev had been responsible for bringing a whole new ballet experience to the West, and that this was the last performance of the tour before the company returned to Russia. It was an experience that Morda was unaware of. It was an entertainment form reserved almost exclusively for members of the Populite. Eventually, the dancers came to a bowing halt at the front of the stage. The house lights rose and Morda looked quizzically at the other occupant of the box. She watched him closely as he formulated his words. "All right, it's a royal ballet performance. I am quite interested. But what's the real reason for bringing me here?" "I thought you might like it. Perhaps you don't." "I've only been working at Paulby's for 3 months. I'm still an apprentice until October. You hardly know me. Can you blame me for being suspicious?" "I can't blame you, no, but you seem different from when I spoke to you during the meal at Paulby's. The ticket for that evening came to me through the internal mail." She laughed. He found it difficult to look away from her. Women generally wore their hair tucked into their hats or scarves. She'd let hers down. It fell comfortably over her shoulders. It would be easy to tell her that he wanted her to find somewhere where they could be truly alone, where he could look at her. It would have been enough. "I got my curfew pass at the desk," he said, "but I still have to be back before midnight." He wanted her to take command of the situation, to declare her reasons, her desires, even if she had to tell him it wasn't a good idea after all. "You must be back by midnight," she said, with a little irony. It was as if she knew what he was going back to, a tiny house in Hammersmith, a 20-year-old lover he was about to sell himself to for 15 years. These were not security expenses she was likely to incur as a member of the Populite. He finally looked away from her. He dropped the theatre programme to his left to create the diversion necessary to adjust his dress. To say he was wearing his heart on his sleeve went only halfway towards capturing the problem men had with the expression of sexual feeling. He looked back at her and smiled. Perhaps he should tell her about Provlin, if she didn't know. While he was making up his mind, the lights began to die down and the second half of the performance began. Although it seemed the most natural thing in the world to lean across and take her hand, he did not. However, as the ballet continued and the palms of his hands grew wet, he decided that no matter how long it took, no matter what personal sacrifices he had to make, he would see her again. As he approached the house, he was surprised to see all of the lights out. It was 5 to 10. Morda would not be in bed yet, if he was there. He went down the alleyway and looked up at the back of the house, but still no lights. He remembered the day after the killings at the house in Whitechapel. He raised his hand to his jaw and pressed it a few times, still fascinated at the stabbing pain it produced. In the dark hallway, he took off his coat. "I'm at the theatre," the note read. "I'll be late back." He was so stupid to be out after curfew, running the risk of being taken in. He could be recognised. As a Caucasian, he was in the minority. He picked up the white plastic card on the table. Provlin Ranshell, A3705112. He looked at himself in the hall mirror. What would Morda say when he got back? He wouldn't react calmly now. He would be angry. Morda had once punched the wall. He could remember the act, but not the reason. It must have been something he'd said about activists. It must have been before he told him about Harville. Last year? Year before? Something in those 4 years before he'd been told. But hitting that wall, what had he said? Couldn't remember. He went upstairs. He would have to write it all down because of Monday. On Monday he would have to tell Lady Chalice. He had to. He closed the curtains and took off his trousers. His underpants were dark with dried blood. He began to weep. He'd tried to tell the doctor, but he'd been too ashamed. And to think he'd gone into work that day, promising himself he would do something if it happened again. I can only relate what happened to me today this way, he wrote. I did not have a fall this afternoon, though I am aware that this will be what you are told. I have been the victim of my own misplaced trust in the others in service at Parkside. This afternoon I was... He thought for a moment. What was the word? Was there no word for what had happened to him? Taken by force did not convey the full horror of his experience. He put a few asterisks and added an ED. She would have to understand. He wrote for another hour and sealed the letter in an envelope, putting it in his work bag. On Monday he would go into work, deliver the letter with a note instructing her to phone him and return home. He was sure she would not involve the police. It would look bad for a politician not to be able to judge the reliability of her own staff. She would perhaps find him another job somewhere else, maybe offer him some compensation, if she was sympathetic. It didn't bear thinking about what might happen if she didn't believe him, but at least he wouldn't have to go back. What was he thinking at this moment? The man whose name he couldn't even bring himself to write. He had just put down the letter D. He must have realized that he'd done something horribly wrong, something criminal. He went upstairs to wash out the stains from his clothes. He took off the dressing from his chin in the bathroom. It was quite badly bruised, but he would use this story of the fall, at least until he knew what was going to be done. He would still sort this out alone. He must not involve Maude. When the key turned nervously in the lock an hour later, he was asleep. The rest of 1909 is available as an ebook or a paperback from amazon.co.uk. Thank you for listening.